Let's delve into the depths of the past to explore one of the most iconic phenomena of Western European history in the Middle Ages: knighthood. It was not merely a military institution, but a complex social structure that defined the feudal order, the system of land ownership, the distribution of power, and the obligations of military service. It was the bedrock of medieval society, exerting a tremendous influence on the politics, culture, and way of life of that era. The concept of the knight took shape gradually over several centuries, under the influence of the unique conditions that arose in Western Europe after the fall of the great Roman Empire. The collapse of the centralized imperial administration, a significant reduction in the size of regular armies, and constant external threats led to military service becoming the foundation of local power. In these turbulent conditions, those who possessed the skill to fight and defend their lands from enemies rose to the forefront. Horsemen clad in heavy armor and armed with powerful weapons gained a particular advantage. Their high mobility and devastating striking power made them a key combat unit on the battlefields. They became the guarantors of security and order in an age when law and order were weak. As early as the 9th century, historical chronicles of the Frankish Empire mention mounted warriors who received land grants as a reward for their faithful service. These brave horsemen became the very foundation from which knighthood would later grow. By the 11th century, heavy cavalry had definitively taken a dominant position in the military system, becoming its main striking force. But how did these warriors become not just soldiers, but representatives of a special class? It was then that the term chevalier appeared, which initially simply denoted a horseman bound by certain obligations to his lord. But over time, this word acquired a deeper meaning, denoting not only a warrior, but also a person with a special status in society. Investiture as a knight became a complex and solemn ritual, confirming membership in this select class. Gradually, the tradition of hereditary transmission of the knightly title emerged, leading to knights occupying a firm and stable place in the social hierarchy. This strengthened their position and made them one of the most important elements of feudal society. The resulting knighthood developed in an environment where personal connections and oaths of loyalty played a decisive role in determining the political order. The system of mutual obligations between lord and vassal became the cornerstone of the feudal system. In exchange for their loyalty and military service, the knight received protection and a land grant from the lord, which he was obliged to hold, manage effectively, and ensure its defense against external threats. These complex relationships were regulated not only by laws, but also by customs, established rights, and unwritten rules of conduct. Over time, these informal agreements gradually acquired legal form, becoming part of the legal system of the Middle Ages. But how did these relationships manifest themselves in different countries of Europe? In France, in the conditions of feudal fragmentation, knighthood became particularly strong. A weak royal authority forced each feudal lord to rely on his own military retinue to ensure his safety and maintain power. The knight became an integral part of the local authority, leading to the formation of a special culture of service, in which norms of behavior were supported not only by direct orders, but also by strict etiquette. At the same time, stable images of the noble warrior, living according to strict rules of honor and morality, began to appear in literature. However, in England, the situation developed somewhat differently. After the Norman conquest in the 11th century, a centralized power structure was established in the country. Each English knight knew his immediate lord and received land in exchange for clearly defined service, enshrined in formal obligations. The military function of the knight was combined with an administrative one, making him an important element of the management system. Knights actively participated in local government, legal proceedings, and the maintenance of order. By the 12th century, this class had become an integral part of the political system of England. But what made a knight a knight? Their high position in society was confirmed by noble origin, special upbringing, and a complex initiation ceremony that distinguished them from representatives of other classes. The Christian Church, in turn, sought to guide the knights on the path of virtue, calling on them to observe established moral norms. Knights were prescribed to defend the weak and defenseless, remain loyal to their lord, and live in accordance with religious obligations. Under the influence of the Church, a concept of knightly behavior gradually formed, which included qualities such as personal honor, restraint, nobility, and submission to the established order. The knight became a key figure on whom local power, military organization, and the ideology of service rested. But how long did this phenomenon last, and what changes awaited it in the future? Knighthood, as a unique phenomenon, took shape over several centuries and left an indelible mark on the social and cultural history of Europe. In this series, we will examine the history of knighthood in detail, exploring its origin, development, transformation into a special class, and the transformations that occurred with it over time. We will learn how knighthood influenced the formation of European civilization and what lessons we can learn from its history. So, let us continue our journey into the world of knights and learn more about their glorious deeds and difficult fate. Knighthood, as a special military class, originated and took shape during a period of deep political and social upheaval that swept Western Europe after the fall of the great Western Roman Empire. This empire, which lasted for about 5 centuries, was not only a military power, but also a complex branched system of government, legislation, trade, and comprehensive administrative control. It united under its banner a wide variety of peoples and territories, stretching from the distant British Isles to the scorching North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Balkans. The empire meticulously maintained a network of roads, stationed garrisons to protect its borders, ensured stable monetary circulation, and created a unified legal framework for all its citizens. However, by the beginning of the 5th century AD, the internal stability of this colossus began to crumble relentlessly. Economic decline, a significant reduction in the number of free peasants, an ever-increasing dependence on mercenaries, excessive administrative overload, and constant pressure on the borders from barbarian tribes turned the once mighty empire into a weak and lifeless shell. Germanic tribes, who had previously served in the Roman army and concluded various alliances with Rome, began to settle more and more actively on its territory, gradually displacing the former Roman elite. In 410 AD, Rome was captured for the first time in many centuries by the Visigoth army under the leadership of Alaric. This tragic act became the symbolic beginning of the end of the great empire. The formal collapse of the empire occurred in 476, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by Odoacer, a Germanic military leader. It is noteworthy that his nickname, Augustulus, meant Little Augustus, and carried a clearly derogatory connotation, emphasizing his young age and lack of real power and authority. While the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued to exist, in the West, the political space was fragmented into many small entities. But who took the place of the emperor in the collapsing state? Instead of a single and centralized management structure, dozens of small kingdoms and estates appeared, each striving for independence. Laws no longer came from a single center, but were developed and applied locally. Instead of imperial officials endowed with power, power passed to local leaders, military nobility, and tribal elite, who acted mainly on the basis of brute force. In these chaotic conditions, the population sought protection from those who were able to effectively hold the land and organize armed resistance against enemies. Thus began the long and complex process of the formation of the feudal order, which subsequently defined the appearance of medieval Europe. Its basis was personal agreements between the owner of the land and the person who was willing to serve him with arms in hand. The land transferred for use became a kind of pledge of loyalty and guarantee of fulfillment of obligations. These land plots were called fiefs, and the relationship between the landowner and the warrior was called vassalage. This form of dependence included clearly defined obligations, which were secured by a public oath, symbolic gestures, and a solemn vow. But how did these relationships form into a complex hierarchy? Gradually, a complex hierarchical system was formed, in which each person clearly knew to whom he owed service and from whom he received protection and patronage. These relationships were not absolutely the same in all regions of Europe, but they were based on the same general scheme. Land was given for service, service required patronage, and patronage obligated loyalty and devotion. Society gradually became more militarized and class-based. Military force was now based not on universal conscription, as it was in the Roman Empire, but on the personal obligation of each individual. A certain person, or vassal, was obliged to serve his lord in exchange for land, patronage, and high status in society. But where did this system take root particularly quickly? He was required to arrive at the first call of his lord, bring armed men with him, as well as maintain order on his land and actively participate in the defense of his possessions from external enemies. This system took root particularly quickly and effectively in Gaul, on the territory of modern-day France. In the 6th and 7th centuries, the Franks, a warlike Germanic people, established their dominance here. Their power rested on a firm alliance between the tribal nobility and the royal dynasty, with the military elite playing a crucial role in maintaining order and expanding the state's territory. The reign of Charlemagne, an outstanding ruler, was of exceptional importance for strengthening the feudal system. This king, and later emperor, not only significantly expanded the borders of his state, but also established a new way of governing based on personal loyalty and devotion. But how exactly did Charlemagne use land to consolidate his power? He actively used land grants to maintain the loyalty of his confidants and military leaders. Land became a generous reward for participating in military campaigns, defending the state's borders, suppressing rebellions, and effectively managing individual regions. In this way, Charlemagne created an extensive network of supporters who had a vested interest in preserving his power. Each of these supporters was obligated to provide armed men at a moment's notice whenever there was a threat of invasion or a war broke out. This contributed to the emergence of a new military stratum in society, heavily armed horsemen, professional warriors. These horsemen differed significantly from the regular people's militia, which consisted of ordinary peasants. But what was this difference? Heavily armed horsemen differed from ordinary militiamen in that they owned their own horse harnesses, expensive armor, specialized weapons, and even had servants. In addition, they had the unique opportunity to learn the art of war from a very young age, which made them true professionals in their field. Forming cavalry of this caliber required significant financial investment and careful preparation. But what were the duties of these professional warriors? A horseman had to be proficient in the art of horsemanship, skillfully handle a spear, a sharp sword, and a reliable shield. He carefully monitored the condition of his equipment, commanded subordinates, actively participated in military gatherings, solemn ceremonies, and even in legal proceedings. A knight's service included not only participation in military operations, but also the management of his estates. But what were these people called in different parts of Europe? Such people were called by different names depending on the region and language. In Latin texts, they were often referred to as milites, meaning soldiers, in administrative documents as equites, which translates as horsemen, and among ordinary people they were known as caballarii. However, it was in France that the term chevalier gradually became established as the most common. It came from the Latin word caballarius, and originally denoted a mounted warrior in the service of a lord. But what did this word symbolize over time? Over time, this word shifted from ordinary vocabulary to a class designation, becoming a symbol of a new order based on military dependence, an unbreakable oath of loyalty, and personal devotion to one's lord. With the establishment of the feudal order, the society of Western Europe gradually acquired a rigid hierarchical structure in which each person occupied their clearly defined place. But what did this structure look like? The idea of three main estates, each performing its divinely ordained function, became firmly established. This idea found its expression in the Latin formula, which sounds like oratores, bellatores, and laboratores, which translates to those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. But where did this idea come from? Its origin dates back to ecclesiastical treatises of the 10th and 11th centuries, and it quickly took root in the public consciousness as a way to explain why estate inequality is considered natural and fair. Those who prayed included priests, monks, and bishops. Their main task was to pray for the entire Christian world, guide the souls of believers to salvation, and monitor the spiritual purity of society. But how exactly did they do this? Through preaching, performing rites and rituals, and observing the vow of celibacy, they became intermediaries between ordinary people and the Almighty God. Those who fought, in turn, guarded the established order and ensured the security of society. What were their duties? They possessed the power, the right to bear arms, the ability to act in battle, and to defend the interests of their lords and the king. They maintained power locally, suppressed rebellions and uprisings, accompanied priests on pilgrimages, and defended their possessions from external enemies. They were considered guardians of peace and justice, whose valor and courage were combined with discipline and loyalty. But who provided for the existence of these two privileged estates? Those who worked formed the basis of the entire social pyramid. They plowed the land, cared for livestock, built houses, forged metal, maintained roads, and supplied everything necessary to the rest of society. These were peasants, artisans, merchants, and townspeople. Their tireless labor provided for the existence of all three estates. But how did this system affect the development of knighthood? These people, bearing the burden of the main tax burden and providing society with everything necessary for existence, faced incredible difficulties in their daily lives. However, it was on their shoulders that the entire social structure rested, like a colossus resting on fragile foundations. This division of society not only described the existing state of affairs, but also fixed in people's minds the idea of the immutability of the estate hierarchy, of the impossibility of moving from one social stratum to another. Each individual was obliged to perform the role prescribed to them by fate, like an actor playing their role in an eternal play. Everyone had to submit to a certain divine order, established, as it was believed, once and for all, as if carved on the tablets of history. This idea was the cornerstone of the medieval worldview, determining people's views on the world and their place in it. Among all the estates, those who fought occupied a special, privileged position, like guards protecting order. But what determined their special position in society? Those who wielded the sword and served their lord faithfully and truthfully formed the basis of the entire feudal system, like columns supporting the vault of a building. Their status was determined by the right to perform military service, which was an exclusive privilege. This right received public recognition through participation in military campaigns, swearing allegiance to one's lord, and later through a special initiation ceremony that definitively separated the knight from the simple warrior, like an initiation marking a transition to a new life. Military service, sealed by oath and contract, gradually turned into an honorary title, passed down through inheritance like a family heirloom. The knight became a representative of a privileged estate, closely associated with power and endowed with special rights and obligations. He received a name and a badge of honor, confirming his belonging to the feudal elite, like a seal certifying his authenticity. Knighthood in medieval Europe was a strictly limited estate, where access was not open to everyone. But what criteria determined belonging to this elite circle? Membership in the knighthood was determined primarily by origin, like blood determining a person's fate. Knights were mainly men born into families of free feudal lords whose ancestors had served their lords faithfully for generations. Lineage was confirmed by the right to participate in military service, receiving a fief, that is, land ownership, and recognition from other members of the nobility, like a recommendation from respected members of a club. Access to the knighthood was virtually closed to the dependent population, who were completely under the power of the feudal lords. So what was the position of those who did not have the opportunity to become a knight? Rural residents, who were under the control of the lord and deprived of legal freedom, could not be knighted, as if they lacked an invisible seal that would open the doors to this world. In different countries, they were called by different names, for example, serfs or villains, but their status was always the same, dependent and without rights. They were forbidden to own land, move independently, and bear arms, as if they were tied to the land by invisible chains. Even possessing wealth or outstanding service merits, they remained outside the circle of knights, like stars shining in the distance but not approaching the earth. In rare cases, for exceptional courage and valor on the battlefield, a dependent peasant could be elevated to knighthood, but such examples were extremely rare, more of an exception that proved the rule. Even in families of free landowners, the status of knight was not automatically passed from father to son, like a gift passed down through inheritance. So how could a young man become a knight and earn this honorary title? A young man had to go through a strictly defined path, full of trials and tribulations, before gaining the right to be called a knight, like a traveler striving for the top of a mountain. At the age of about 7, he was sent to the house of a lord or relative, where his formal education began, like a seedling transplanted into fertile soil. From that moment on, he became a page, a servant and apprentice, like a budding actor learning the basics of the craft. His training included elements of service and imitation. He had to follow the example of his elders in everything. He maintained order, watched the knights, attended ceremonies, learned discipline and respect, like a sponge absorbing knowledge and experience. The page's duties included participating in ceremonies, taking care of the clothing and weapons of his elders, and carrying out various errands, as if he was the right hand of his master. His life was under constant supervision. His every step was under close scrutiny. But what exactly was the future knight supposed to learn during this period of his life? A page had to memorize the manners, speech, and behavior of knights, so that in the future he could match their image, like copying a flawless original. At 15 or 16 years old, the page became a squire, like a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. Now his functions were approaching combat, and he began to participate in real battles. He accompanied the knight on trips and gatherings, watched over his armor, brought the horse, and participated in training like a shadow, constantly following his master. He was allowed to participate in tournaments and hunts, entrusted with the care of equipment, and became an indispensable assistant to the knight in all his affairs. In battles, the squire took his place in the battle formation, most often next to his lord, ready to come to his aid at any moment, like a loyal dog guarding its owner. He had no right to act on his own initiative, but he could find himself in a combat situation where the knight's life depended on his actions. In the chronicles of those times, there are cases when squires, showing courage and resourcefulness, entered the battle if circumstances forced them to take responsibility, as if they felt a duty to their lord. But what else besides combat skills was the squire supposed to acquire? The squire learned not only swordsmanship, but also the tactics of warfare, the routine of the camp, and the duties in peacetime, as if he was preparing to become a full-fledged knight. He observed court sessions, ceremonies, and negotiations, which gave him an idea of the broader meaning of knightly service, as if he was getting to know the world in all its diversity. He was a pupil, in the final stage of preparation for recognition, like a sculptor finishing work on his masterpiece. Investiture as a knight took place after the candidate reached maturity and earned trust with his courage and dedication. What rituals accompanied this important event? The knighting ceremony completed a long and thorny path that began in childhood, like a crown completing painstaking work. It took place in a solemn atmosphere and confirmed that the person was recognized as worthy of belonging to the knightly class, like a diploma from a prestigious university. The ceremony began with ablution, symbolizing purification before entering a new status, like a baptism, marking the beginning of a new life. Then the candidate spent the night in prayer, most often in the castle chapel, next to the weapon that became a symbol of his future service, like a warrior preparing for the upcoming battle. But what awaited the newly minted knight ahead? With the first rays of the sun breaking through the stained glass windows of the castle, he appeared before his lord, kneeling in a sign of respect and devotion, like a pilgrim before a shrine. He was presented with a sword and spurs, symbols of his new status and responsibilities, like keys to the gates leading to the world of knighthood. Then the lord gave a light blow with the flat of the sword on the shoulder of the newly minted knight, confirming his title and blessing him for exploits, like a seal certifying his authenticity. This gesture, seemingly simple, contained a deep meaning, like a thread connecting the past and the future. From this momentous moment, the person gained the right to serve his lord, command warriors, bear the family coat of arms, and be recognized as equal among other knights, like a member of an elite club. Only a king, a large feudal lord, or a recognized knight with sufficient authority and respect could knight someone, like a priest performing a sacred rite. After that, the newly minted knight took an oath, brief, but filled with deep meaning and promises, like a code of honor that he had to follow throughout his life. In his oath, he promised to remain loyal to his lord, to protect the weak and oppressed, to live by the laws of honor and justice, like a knight of the Round Table dedicated to serving good. Witnesses were present, confirming the legality of what was happening, and everything had public force, like the conclusion of an important agreement. After taking the oath, the new knight rose from his knee, and from that day on, he could participate in military gatherings, dispose of land, and enter into vassal relations, like a full member of feudal society. The knighting ceremony completed a long and complex process of education, service, and recognition, definitively consolidating a person's position as a warrior, vassal, and representative of the knightly order. But was the title of knight always passed down by inheritance? Although knighthood for a long time remained a hereditary class based on noble origin and noble upbringing, in various periods of history, those who did not belong to the nobility by birth could also be elevated to it, like an exception that proves the rule. The basis for investiture as a knight was special merits shown in battle, or boundless devotion to one's lord or king, like a reward for bravery and loyalty. Such exceptions were especially common starting from the end of the 13th century and throughout the 14th century, when the social structure of European states became more mobile and dynamic, like a river changing its course. In the first half of the Middle Ages, the knighting of people who did not have noble origins remained extremely rare, like searching for a needle in a haystack. But already in the conditions of the Crusades, when European knights fought for the liberation of the Holy Land, more cases appeared when commanders raised to the rank of knight warriors who showed particular bravery in battle or in the defense of Christian shrines, like recognizing their feat in the face of danger. The chronicles of that time mention warriors of simple origin who received a sword from the hands of their commanders for showing courage during the siege of enemy fortresses, or in bloody battles with the infidels, like a reward for valor that surpasses pedigree. These were isolated, but at the same time significant cases, when personal heroism and the act committed prevailed over noble ancestry, like a ray of light breaking through the thick darkness. In 14th century France and England, military service was becoming increasingly professional, and many knights were not hereditary vassals, but veterans who had gone through a long and difficult combat path as part of the royal armies, like tempered steel that has passed through fire. Such people, especially during periods of protracted military conflicts, could receive the title of knight for faithful and selfless service to their monarch, like recognizing their professionalism and experience. Kings and dukes used knighting as an effective way to strengthen their power and secure the loyalty of their subjects, like a magnet attracting iron. One of the most famous examples is the story of Bertrand du Guesclin, the son of a petty nobleman from Brittany, who, thanks to his incredible bravery in battles, was awarded the title of knight, and later became the commander-in-chief of the French army, like an elevation from rags to riches. In some cases, townspeople and merchants who had reached a high position in society and accumulated enormous wealth could also be knighted, especially if they provided financial support for military campaigns or performed important administrative functions like a reward for their contribution to the common cause. But how did the status of knights who received the title not by birth change? In 15th century England, this practice became part of a political strategy, especially in cities where self-governing structures were actively developing, like a tool to maintain stability and order. Such people were presented with a sword and shield, symbols of their knightly dignity. They took part in solemn ceremonies and had the right to bear the family coat of arms, but at the same time remained outside the noble inheritance system, like honored guests, but not full members of the family. From the end of the 14th century, against the backdrop of the strengthening of centralized armies and the increasing role of mercenaries in military conflicts, the latter also began to claim knightly status, like striving for recognition and respect. But how could mercenaries obtain the title of knight? They fought as part of regular troops, served under the banners of kings and dukes, received a salary for their service, and unquestioningly obeyed the orders of their commanders, like soldiers of fortune seeking glory and wealth. Some mercenary commanders, especially captains of large detachments, were raised to the rank of knight in recognition of their extensive experience and outstanding merits on the battlefield, like a reward for professionalism and dedication. This happened especially often during periods of protracted and bloody wars, when the acute need for professional soldiers and experienced commanders outweighed the traditional requirements for noble origin, like in a crisis, when only skills and experience are important. The most striking example of a commoner awarded the title of knight dates back to the mid-15th century. Jacques de Lalaing, the son of an ordinary official of the ducal court, could not boast of noble origin, but thanks to his outstanding bravery, incredible strength, and active participation in knightly tournaments, he was knighted at the Burgundian court like a rising star, illuminating everything around with its radiance. The knighting of Jacques de Lalaing highlighted the growing role of personal qualities and heroic feats in late medieval society, like a new era in which not only roots but also fruits are valued. Despite the fact that these cases remained more the exception than the rule, they clearly demonstrate the gradual expansion of the concepts associated with knighthood and the changing perceptions of who can be worthy of this high title. But what consequences did these changes have for the knightly class as a whole? The title of knight, despite all the changes, retained its symbolic value and prestige in the eyes of society, but its acquisition was increasingly associated with the manifestation of personal qualities, the achievement of military successes, and the demonstration of unwavering loyalty to one's lord or king, and not exclusively with noble origin and ancient ancestry, like not only roots, but also fruits, became the measure of valor. After a detailed description of the path of a knight as a warrior and vassal, it is necessary to consider what place a woman occupied in this complex feudal structure, like another puzzle piece complementing the overall picture. She, of course, did not take direct part in battles on the battlefield, but her position in society had a significant impact on land relations, the development of courtly culture, and the formation of social ties, like an invisible force directing the course of history. Women played a significant and at times crucial role in the social environment where chivalry flourished, much like a muse inspiring knights to great deeds. Her status was defined by her lineage, her marital bond, and her affiliation with a particular family, like the three pillars upon which her world rested. In feudal Europe, a woman could become the rightful heir to ancestral lands and titles if there were no direct male descendants in the family, as if fate were placing a tremendous responsibility on her shoulders. In such cases, she inherited not only the lands but also the family titles, along with the right to govern these possessions, making her a full-fledged ruler of her territories. This practice was particularly prevalent in France and England, where women often found themselves at the head of large feudal estates, seemingly proving their ability to govern as well as men. The widow of a feudal lord typically retained the right to hold the fief until she remarried, or until the inheritance was passed on to the rightful heir, acting as a temporary ruler, ensuring stability during a period of change. She made important decisions, corresponded with other feudal lords, and when necessary, organized the defense of her territories against enemies, like a brave warrior protecting her home. One of the most striking and well-known examples of a strong and influential woman in medieval Europe was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her vast lands stretched from the banks of the Loire to the Pyrenees, encompassing a significant portion of France, like an entire kingdom. Before her marriage to the French king Louis VII, she independently and successfully governed Aquitaine, demonstrating her exceptional administrative abilities, and after the annulment of that marriage, she married Henry Plantagenet and became Queen of England, as if conquering one peak after another. Eleanor of Aquitaine actively participated in state affairs, accompanied her husband on diplomatic trips, maintained active correspondence with influential figures, and retained her political influence even after being imprisoned by her husband for supporting her son's rebellion against royal authority like an indomitable spirit unbroken by any trials. Through marriages, women became important links between different feudal families, strengthening political alliances and contributing to the establishment of regional stability. But was this all there was to a woman's role in feudal society? The conclusion of marriages involving women was a crucial part of political calculations aimed at strengthening power and expanding influence, like a chess game where every move has strategic significance. Along with the woman, not only lands were transferred to another family, but also legal rights and symbolic legitimacy, like a dowry whose value was measured not only in material goods, but also in political capital. Often, it was marriage to the heiress of a wealthy and influential family that made a knight the rightful owner of the land and strengthened his position in society, like a key opening the doors to power and wealth. Marriage agreements had the force of law, and the distribution of power and influence in the region directly depended on their terms, like the foundation on which the prosperity of the entire family was built. But what influence did women have on courtly culture? In courtly culture, a knight often participated in jousting tournaments on behalf of the lady of his heart, demonstrating his valor and devotion as if dedicating his exploits to her. Before entering the arena, the knight would loudly proclaim his lady's name and receive some token of her affection, usually a ribbon, an embroidered handkerchief, a glove, or a belt, as if receiving a blessing for victory. Furthermore, the knight would dedicate his potential victory in the tournament to her, extolling her beauty and virtues as if immortalizing her in his songs. However, such actions were not always an expression of deep romantic attachment, but rather a part of a courtly ritual emphasizing the knight's nobility and courtesy. But what lay behind these tokens of affection and gallant gestures? Support and recognition from noble figures played an important role in affirming a knight's status, confirming his belonging to a select circle recognized in aristocratic society. A courtly lady, typically from a respected family and influential at court, often took on the role of a knight's patroness. She might show him signs of attention, publicly demonstrating her favor and support. Such a lady had the power to award prizes for valor, defend the knight before superiors, strengthen his good name, and even to some extent influenced decisions regarding his career and position at court. Some influential ladies patronized several knights at once. Their names, as evidence of their significance, can be found on the pages of historical chronicles, in the texts of songs, and in personal correspondence of that time. A knight's behavior in the presence of a lady was strictly regulated by courtly etiquette, and any deviation from these norms was seen as a serious violation of the established social order, potentially leading to negative consequences for the knight's reputation and career. However, in some cases, the relationships between a knight and a lady went beyond the prescribed conventions and became more personal. But how far could these relationships go, and what could be the consequences if they became public knowledge? An example of such a situation is the story that occurred in Burgundy in the late 15th century. Marguerite de Lorraine, wife of Jean de Chalon, entered into a close relationship with the knight Pierre de Langelan, who was in her court and served as her representative in various court ceremonies and events. When this affair became known to the Duke, the knight was immediately arrested. This scandalous story gained wide publicity and entered the historical chronicles as a vivid example of the unacceptable mixing of personal feelings and courtly duties, showing that even in the highest circles of society there were strict boundaries of what was permissible. But what happened beyond the glittering halls and strict rules of the court, where life was far from the idealized notions of chivalry? Outside the courtly circle, in a world where life was harsh and full of dangers, the position of women was quite different. Women who did not belong to the nobility could not count on patronage, ritual service, or protection from the court. Their safety depended directly on the will of the Lord, who controlled the land on which they lived, and on communal norms, which unfortunately were not always consistently and fairly observed. Documents from the 13th and 14th centuries contain numerous mentions of cases of sexual violence committed by knights, for which they generally suffered no punishment. Their power and authority allowed them to remain unpunished, which created an atmosphere of lawlessness and fear. How did the Church, as the moral authority of the time, try to combat such manifestations of lawlessness and cruelty? The Church attempted to curb such behavior through sermons, appeals for adherence to vows, and threats of excommunication. But these measures, unfortunately, had only a symbolic effect and could not realistically change the situation. The contrast between the idealized image of service to a lady, celebrated in chivalric romances, and the harsh reality prevailing in the field was an integral part of the feudal order. In Christian culture, the image of a woman was often associated with the Virgin Mary, a symbol of purity, mercy, and protection. How did this religious image influence the perception of women in society and the role assigned to them in chivalric culture? The name of the Virgin Mary was included in prayers, and her image was often placed on coats of arms, believing that she was the knight's intercessor, protecting him in battles and helping him in difficult moments of life. The connection between religious purity and service to a lady was emphasized in texts and rituals, especially during the Crusades, when knights went to distant lands to fight for the faith. But what if a woman herself took up arms and became a warrior capable of defending herself and her loved ones? Were there such examples in medieval history? And how did society perceive women who violated traditional gender roles? Although knighthood was traditionally considered an estate associated exclusively with men, their service and their right to bear arms, history has preserved examples of women who directly participated in the military structure, defended their lands, and performed functions traditionally attributed to knights. Two such outstanding figures are Joan of Arc and Petronilla de Coucy. Both of these women acted within a system where they could not formally claim the title of knight, but were perceived by contemporaries as its rightful bearers, demonstrating courage, determination, and dedication to their cause. But who was Joan of Arc, and how was she able to achieve such recognition in a male-dominated world? Joan of Arc was born in the village of Domremy in the late 14th century into a family of prosperous peasants. From an early age, she claimed to hear the voices of saints who directed her to a special mission, to help Charles Valois, the rightful heir to the French throne, drive the English from French soil and restore justice. At the age of about 16, she went to Vaucouleurs and appealed to the local garrison to pass her on to the court in order to convey her message to the king. How did they react to her unusual statement? And was she able to convince those around her of her sincerity and dedication to her mission? In the spring of 1429, Joan appeared before Charles in Chinon, passed a theological examination designed to confirm the truth of her words, and received permission to accompany the army. Soon she arrived at besieged Orléans and took a key place in the military campaign, inspiring soldiers to fight and instilling in them confidence in victory. Her appearance had a huge impact on the morale of the troops and strengthened the soldiers' belief in the success of the venture. But how did a simple peasant woman manage to win the trust of military leaders and ordinary soldiers? And what qualities allowed her to become a leader and a symbol of hope for an entire nation? The victory at Orléans marked a turning point in the war with the English. Within months, Charles was ceremoniously crowned at Reims, and Joan accompanied him on campaigns, participated in war councils, and maintained a reputation as someone whose actions were determined not by personal interest, but solely by faith and devotion to her mission. What principles guided Joan in her life, and what helped her remain steadfast in her convictions, despite all the hardships and trials that befell her? She lived apart from the others, wore armor, prayed daily, maintained order in the camp, and did not allow violations. Her image is that of a person with inner strictness and a deep sense of purpose. Even those who were skeptical of her origins and unusual claims recognized the power of her influence on people and her ability to inspire feats of bravery. But what awaited Joan ahead, and would she be able to complete her mission to the end? In 1431, while defending Compiègne, Joan was captured. The Burgundians, betraying her interests, handed her over to the English, which marked the beginning of the infamous trial. The formal charges brought against her were heresy and wearing men's clothing, which was a blatant violation of the religious and social norms of the time. But did these charges truly reflect the real reason for her persecution, or were they concealing political motives and fear of her influence? The trial of Joan took place in Rouen and lasted more than 2 months, during which she was subjected to grueling interrogations and psychological pressure. Ultimately, she was given a harsh sentence, which included execution by burning. The sentence was carried out in the market square, and Joan was burned alive at the age of 19, becoming a martyr and a symbol of the struggle for freedom and justice. But was her death the end of the story, or did it mark the beginning of her immortal glory? 25 years later, her case was reviewed and overturned, and in the 20th century, she was canonized by the Catholic Church, becoming the patron saint of France. Her name has forever entered history as an embodiment of resilience, devotion, and the highest form of service, inspiring people to fight for their ideals and values. However, long before Joan of Arc, there lived another woman who also showed courage and determination in defending her land and her people. Who was this woman, and in what historical circumstances did she have to demonstrate her outstanding qualities? Petronilla de Caëlan lived 1.5 centuries before Joan, in the mid-13th century in the Languedoc region. She came from a poor noble family that owned a small fortified fief, which she had to defend from enemies. How did this affect her life, and what trials did she have to overcome? During an armed conflict between neighboring lordships, she found herself at the center of a siege when her estates were surrounded by enemy troops. The chronicles of the monastery of Saint-Hilaire mention how she skillfully organized the defense, took responsibility for the garrison, arranged the placement of supplies, and conducted complex negotiations with the besiegers. How did she manage to maintain calm and composure in a critical situation? And what decisions did she make to protect her people? One of the charters, drawn up after the siege was lifted, has been preserved in the archives of the bishopric, and it is her signature that appears under the terms of the agreement, which testifies to her authority and influence. After the end of the conflict, Petronilla continued to manage the fief, showing wisdom and fairness. She participated in resolving land disputes, approved marriage contracts, and conducted family affairs without the formal intervention of a man, which was unusual for that time. How did her contemporaries regard a woman managing a feudal estate, and what qualities did they value in her? Her contemporaries described her as a woman acting with firmness and calculation, capable of making balanced decisions and defending her interests. The lack of knighthood did not prevent her from performing the same functions, protecting, governing, and maintaining order, proving that true chivalry lies not in formal title, but in deeds and moral qualities. But what made a knight a knight? What items of weaponry were an integral part of his appearance, and what role did they play in battle? Now, let's take a closer look at the knight's equipment, which played an important role in his life and on the battlefield. When he went into battle, he always carried a sword, spear, and shield, which were the main attributes of his military profession. But there were also other types of weapons that he could use depending on the situation. Depending on the situation, he could carry a war hammer, axe, or mace designed for close combat. All equipment was selected taking into account the upcoming task, and each item had its own meaning, being part of preparation, status, and a guarantee of survival in the harsh conditions of war. But which item of weaponry was considered the most important and symbolic for a knight? The sword was considered the heart of knightly armor, a symbol of his honor, valor, and strength. Its length was about 90 centimeters, which allowed for quick and accurate strikes. What was the sword made of, and what qualities should it have? It was a straight blade with a sharp tip and double-edged sharpening, which allowed for both stabbing and slashing attacks. The hilt ended with a guard, which protected the hand from enemy weapons, and a massive pommel, which balanced the blade and made it easier to use. The sword was used to chop, stab, and deflect blows, demonstrating the skill and strength of the owner. How was the sword made, and what technologies did the blacksmiths of that time use? A good blade was forged from tempered steel and often decorated with inscriptions, coats of arms, or the master's mark, which gave it individuality and served as a sign of quality. The sword was passed down from generation to generation, becoming a family heirloom and a symbol of the knightly family. But what else besides the sword was an important part of knightly equipment, providing his protection and identification on the battlefield? The shield served not only as protection from enemy attacks, but also as a sign of distinction, allowing the knight to be identified on the battlefield. What shape was the shield, and what materials was it made of? In the early centuries, it was made in a teardrop shape. This shape allowed protecting not only the chest, but also the hip, covering the rider all the way from shoulder to knee, providing maximum protection from arrows and sword blows. How did the shape of the shield change over time, and what factors influenced these changes? When moving in the saddle, the lower part of the shield comfortably rested on the hip, and the upper part overlapped the body, providing comfort and protection during riding. Over time, the shape of the shields changed, and rectangular or triangular shields appeared, which became lighter and more convenient for infantry, allowing them to maneuver on the battlefield. What was the shield made of, and how was it decorated? The material was wood, glued in layers, and covered with leather with metal overlays, which ensured strength and reliability. On the outside, a coat of arms, family colors, or the Lord's colors were applied, which made it possible to recognize an ally in battle, keep formation, and indicate belonging to a certain army or feudal domain. Were there other types of shields designed for special tasks and combat conditions? In city garrisons and during sieges, the pavis was also used. This is a tall shield that can cover a person from head to toe, providing complete protection from arrows and projectiles. How was the pavis used, And what advantages did it give to the defenders of the fortress? It was placed vertically in the ground and served as cover for archers and crossbowmen, allowing them to fire accurately at the enemy while remaining safe. The pavis was heavy, more often used by infantry, and was not part of the knights' everyday weaponry, but its use in the 13th century was evidence of how the means of protection diversified, adapting to new conditions of war. But what weapon was the main one in a cavalry charge, and what role did it play in victory on the battlefield? The spear played a decisive role in the cavalry charge, allowing knights to inflict devastating blows on enemy ranks. How long was the spear, and how did the knight use it in battle? Its length could reach 3 meters, which allowed striking the enemy at a distance. The knight clamped the shaft under his arm, rested it against the belt loop on the armor, and directed the tip at the target, using all the strength of his body and horse. What effect did a spear strike have, and how could it affect the outcome of the battle? Upon collision, the force of the impact increased due to the speed of the horse, which allowed piercing shields, breaking armor, and knocking the enemy off their feet. Such a blow could decide the outcome of the battle, turning the enemy to flight. But how was the spear used in tournaments, and how did they differ from real combat? In tournaments, the tips were blunted, and the shaft was strengthened so as not to kill the opponent. But even then, injuries were a common outcome, which made tournaments a dangerous and exciting spectacle. But what did knights use in close combat when the spear was already broken or lost? In close combat, war hammers, maces, and axes were used, designed to crush armor and inflict deadly blows. But what type of weapon was most effective in close combat, and what skills were required of a knight for its successful use? The war hammer, thanks to its design, was especially effective against plate armor, which became increasingly common on battlefields. Its butt was designed to inflict pinpoint strikes on the joints of the armor, piercing them and disabling the enemy, and the massive side crushed the armor, causing serious injuries. The mace, in turn, inflicted powerful blows on the body, destroying protection and causing internal damage, which made it a formidable weapon in close combat. But what other types of weapons appeared in the arsenal of knights in the 13th century, and what advantages did they give their owners? From the 13th century onwards, two-handed swords began to appear on battlefields, demanding particular strength and skill from the warrior. How long were these swords, and how were they used in combat? They reached lengths of 120 centimeters and weighed around 2.5 kilograms, making them a formidable weapon in the hands of an experienced warrior. Holding such a sword required both hands, precluding the use of a standard shield. Furthermore, swinging it while wearing full armor was difficult, limiting its use in battle. Where and when did knights use two-handed swords, and what advantages did they offer? Therefore, knights rarely used such blades. In foot combat, when defending fortifications, in duels, or when facing spearmen, where it was necessary to break the enemy's formation. The two-handed sword was useful for destroying shields and spear shafts, as well as in combat against infantry, but in large-scale battles, it was less versatile than a regular sword, which allowed for both defense and offense. But how much did all this weaponry cost, and who could afford to acquire it? The cost of weaponry was high, making it accessible only to wealthy individuals. In the 13th century, a set including a sword, spear, shield, and auxiliary weapons could cost as much as the annual income from a small village, making it an unaffordable luxury for most of the population. How did young nobles obtain weapons, and what opportunities did they have to acquire them? Young nobles often received weapons as gifts from their liege lord, the king, or a military order, signifying their recognition and trust. Also, as a reward, victors in tournaments and campaigns could receive a sword with personal symbolism, strengthening their position within the knightly class and raising their status. But what else, besides weapons, was an important part of knightly equipment, ensuring protection on the battlefield? Body protection was also a crucial part of the equipment, determining how a knight would move, fight, and survive in battle. What types of armor existed in the Middle Ages, and how did they evolve over time? The first armor consisted of chainmail, a metallic fabric woven from thousands of iron rings, providing flexibility and protection against slashing blows. How was chainmail constructed, and what advantages did it give to the knight? Such armor covered the chest, shoulders, arms and thighs, and the head was covered with a hood of the same structure, providing complete body protection. Chainmail absorbed slashing blows and distributed force across the surface, but offered little protection against heavy, crushing weapons, making it vulnerable to maces and hammers. What was worn underneath chainmail, and what function did this clothing serve? Beneath it, a soft undergarment was worn, a dense quilted shirt called a gambeson, which cushioned blows and protected the skin from metal friction, providing comfort and additional protection. How much did chainmail weigh, and what demands did it place on a knight's physical fitness? The weight of chainmail reached 15 kilograms, and its use required endurance and acclimation, making knightly service arduous and exhausting. How did armor develop over time, and what new protective elements appeared? Over time, protection became more complex. Chainmail gloves were worn on the hands, and cuisses, greaves, and knee cops were worn on the legs, while metal plates were attached over the chainmail, reinforcing the protection of the most vulnerable parts of the body. When did full plate armor appear, and what advantages did it offer to the knight? By the 14th century, full plate armor appeared, covering the entire body and consisting of steel elements tailored to the wearer's figure, providing maximum protection against any weapon. How was plate armor constructed, and how did it allow the knight to move in battle? Each element was connected by hinges and straps, providing mobility and allowing the knight to move and fight freely in battle. The weight of plate armor reached 25 kilograms, but thanks to its even distribution, it could be worn for hours without experiencing severe fatigue. How much did plate armor cost, and who could afford to acquire it? The production of such equipment required the labor of an experienced craftsman, time, and significant expense. It cost as much as it took to maintain a small armed detachment throughout a campaign, making it a symbol of wealth and high social status. How did helmets evolve, and what functions did they perform? Helmets evolved particularly quickly, providing ever-increasing protection for the head and face. From a simple iron cap, they progressed to an enclosed helmet with a movable visor, covering the face and providing maximum protection from blows. Complex ventilation systems were developed to protect the head, designed to provide airflow and prevent overheating, and an internal lining was used to cushion blows and ensure a tighter fit for the helmet. Neck plates, in turn, protected the most vulnerable part of the body from fatal wounds. Specialized helmets were used during knightly tournaments, featuring thickened protection capable of withstanding powerful blows, and typically intentionally limited visibility, forcing the knight to rely on concentration and instincts. However, in real combat situations, when maximum visibility and mobility were required, knights preferred simpler models, often with an open face or narrow slits, allowing them to better see the surrounding environment and react more quickly to threats. A coat of arms, bright feathers, or an image of a totem animal was often attached to the helmet, serving not only as a distinctive symbol indicating belonging to a particular family or brotherhood, but also as a terrifying element designed to demoralize the enemy. Have you ever considered how much this seemingly reliable protection restricted freedom of movement? Despite the obvious advantages, heavy armor also had its significant drawbacks, which could play a fatal role in battle. Putting on full armor alone was almost impossible. The details, each playing its important role, were fastened together by a complex system of belts, tied, buckled, and connected in a strict sequence, requiring a clear understanding of the construction. To don armor, a knight required the help of a squire or specially trained servant who thoroughly knew the order of assembly and fitting of each part, ensuring not only proper fixation, but also maximum comfort and mobility within the constraints imposed by the armor. This certainly made the knight dependent on outside help, especially in critical situations. I wonder, what happened if a knight lost his squire right before a battle? If a knight was unseated by a powerful lance blow or thrown off in hand-to-hand combat, he found himself in an extremely vulnerable position. In heavy armor that restricted movement, getting up from the ground alone was incredibly difficult, especially if a battle raged around and opponents did not allow a moment's respite. The enemy, taking advantage of the fallen warrior's helplessness, tried to finish him off with a well-aimed blow to the visor of the helmet, to the neck, unprotected by thick metal, or to the side, between the plates of armor, where the protection was weakest. In such moments, the knight's life hung by a thread, and the outcome of the battle depended on reaction speed and luck. But was help always nearby? In rare cases, a loyal squire might assist the knight, risking his own life, or a fellow warrior. But more often than not, the outcome was decided within seconds, where every mistake could be fatal. That is why the protection of the head, neck, and lower torso, where vital organs were located, was considered critical. Furthermore, it was extremely difficult to move quickly over rough terrain in armor, significantly reducing the knight's mobility, and solving the simplest physiological needs turned into a real problem. For long campaigns and exhausting sieges, there were lighter versions of armor, providing greater freedom of movement and comfort, but at the expense of the level of protection. However, what did knights choose when their lives were on the line? However, in battle, where every blow could be the last and decide the outcome of the battle, the knight remained in his heavy armor until the end, despite all the inconveniences and limitations, and biological needs had to be endured, gritting his teeth. Many warriors, knowing about the upcoming trials, deliberately limited themselves in food and drink before the battle to avoid unpleasant surprises inside the armor. Historical sources reveal numerous cases where, during protracted battles lasting hours or even days, knights relieved themselves directly in their armor, unable to get out of it. How did the knights themselves feel about this? This was seen as a harsh inevitability, part of military life, and not as a sign of shame or weakness. Along with the armor, which was a symbol of status and protection, his faithful warhorse played an equal role in the life of a knight. It was not merely a means of transportation, allowing him to quickly cover long distances, but also a powerful weapon, an extension of the knight himself, his right hand in battle. The best steeds, distinguished by strength, endurance, and fearlessness, were called destriers. But what made these horses special? These were powerful, tall animals, bred specifically for war through careful selection and years of training. They underwent special training that allowed them not to be afraid of loud shouts, the gleam of cold weapons, the whistling of arrows, the roar of collisions, the noise of battle, and the sight of blood. A destrier was very expensive, and not every knight could afford such a horse. In the 14th century, for example, the price of a war horse was comparable to the cost of a complete set of knightly armor, and in some cases could even exceed it. Have you ever considered how these expensive animals were protected? Steeds were also protected by special equipment designed to minimize the risk of injury and ensure their maximum safety in battle. An iron or chainmail armor was worn on the neck, protecting against blows from above, and a dense fabric impregnated with special compounds or metal plates covered the body, covering the most vulnerable areas. Some steeds even wore a helmet, protecting the head from arrows and blows, and had special bridles decorated with family emblems and heraldic symbols. Losing a horse in battle was considered a severe loss for a knight because, in addition to the enormous material cost, it was a loss of part of his own rank. A source of pride, a symbol of heritage and trust, connecting the rider and the animal by an invisible thread. Are you familiar with any stories about famous war horses? Throughout the chronicles of history, we find the names of celebrated war horses, immortalized alongside their valiant riders, a testament to the profound role they played in chivalric culture. Within the knightly class existed an unspoken code of combat, built upon the principles of mutual recognition, honor, and nobility. It wasn't etched in strict written laws, but it governed conduct on the battlefield, dictating who was worthy of mercy, ransom, or respect, and who should be mercilessly vanquished. These unwritten rules didn't eliminate the brutality inherent in war, but they imposed certain moral limitations on the fighting, especially concerning other knights of equal status and lineage. So, how did these rules manifest on the field of battle? On the battlefield, knights didn't behave as faceless soldiers merely following orders, but as representatives of a specific social class, bound by ties of honor and mutual respect. Among them operated tacit rules, founded on shared values and recognition. A warrior who had been knighted, bearing his own coat of arms as proof of noble birth, and possessing an impeccable reputation, was deemed a worthy adversary. He would not be finished off unnecessarily, particularly if he clearly signaled his intent to surrender, acknowledging his defeat. But what did surrender mean for a knight? If a knight fell from his horse, lost his weapon in fierce combat, or sustained severe injuries that rendered him unable to continue fighting, he could declare his surrender. To do so, it was sufficient to state his name, indicate his lineage, or simply make a clear declaration of submission to the victor's will. In such cases, an enemy abiding by the knightly code of honor would cease his attack and take the knight prisoner. One could even surrender in the midst of battle, for warriors were well aware that captured knights commanded a ransom. What was the price of freedom? For a noble prisoner of high social standing and influence, the family or overlord would pay a hefty ransom in gold, valuable property, or concessions in political negotiations. The ransom amount depended on the prisoner's social rank. For an earl or baron, the sums were astronomical, while for a mere knight, they were far more modest. Capture wasn't considered a shameful act, but a normal part of military practice and a way for the victor to enrich himself. What awaited a knight after returning from captivity? Moreover, capturing a high-born enemy was considered a prestigious achievement, indicative of martial prowess and good fortune. Some knights even intentionally sought to capture opponents alive rather than killing them in battle, especially if they recognized the person as someone of renown, with influence and the ability to pay for his freedom. Within knightly circles, there were even unspoken verbal agreements determining who had the right to a prisoner in a given situation. If several knights surrounded a prisoner simultaneously, each claiming the right to capture him, the dispute was resolved according to the principle of first weapon contact or a verbal claim establishing priority. But what happened to a prisoner after capture? Upon surrendering, the prisoner, having acknowledged his defeat, was immediately placed under secure guard to ensure his safety and prevent any escape attempts. He was provided with food, often quite decent, the opportunity to rest after the intense battle, and sometimes even allowed to wear part of his armor as a sign of respect for his status and martial valor. Particularly important and noble prisoners, for whom a significant ransom could be obtained, were permitted to correspond with the outside world. They were given the chance to send a message with a messenger to their relatives or overlord, requesting the payment of the ransom required for their release. But where were these prisoners held? The most noble and influential prisoners were held in well-guarded castles or in the luxurious tents of commanders, where they were provided with relatively comfortable conditions befitting their high status. In some cases, a riskier but profitable method was employed. Prisoners were released on their honor and oath to return if the ransom wasn't paid by the agreed-upon deadline. However, not all enemies were considered worthy of such treatment by knights. For instance, the foot soldiers, who formed the backbone of the army, were treated with less respect and compassion. Why was this so? Foot soldiers were generally not spared or taken prisoner, as they were considered inferior in military terms, lacking sufficient value, and a potential threat in the event of mass resistance or revolt. If a common foot soldier surrendered, he was most often killed on the spot, without wasting time or resources on his upkeep, as no one would pay a ransom for him. Exceptions were exceedingly rare. only in cases where the foot soldier turned out to be a relative of a noble family, possessing some influence, or displayed extraordinary courage in battle worthy of respect. But what were the battles themselves like? Battles in the age of chivalry rarely took the form of organized duels between individual warriors, as they are often depicted in movies. The core of the battle consisted of powerful strikes in close formation, when massive groups of horsemen crashed into the enemy, sweeping away everything in their path. Knights, having gained momentum on their war horses and armed with long lances, fought from the saddle, trying to knock the opponent off his feet or pierce him with their weapon, colliding with each other in a fierce melee. The battle could last for hours, and after the initial onslaught, the orderly ranks became mixed, and chaos reigned on the battlefield, making it difficult to discern anything. In the heat of battle, a knight couldn't always tell who was friend or foe. How did they distinguish between their own and the enemy? It was possible to distinguish between friend and foe by the coat of arms depicted on the shield or surcoat, but in the chaos of battle, even this identification didn't always work, and it happened that one's own man accidentally struck another, causing injury or even death. Squires, who accompanied the knights in battle, tried to stay close by to help their lord to his feet if necessary, replace broken weapons, or relay important orders. But did knights have any psychological preparation for battle? Psychologically, a knight was carefully prepared for the harsh realities of battle from childhood. From a young age, he was taught restraint, self-control, humility before God, and unquestioning loyalty to his lord. These qualities, instilled from an early age, helped the knight maintain composure and make sound decisions in the most challenging situations. But what did a knight feel in the face of danger? Yet even the most experienced and seasoned warrior felt fear in the face of imminent danger. Some warriors entered a state of uncontrollable rage, allowing them to forget about fear and pain, while others, on the contrary, withdrew into themselves, trying to focus and mobilize all their strength to survive. There were also those who, unable to withstand the pressure, fled the battlefield, and those who died without retreating a single step, demonstrating unparalleled courage and devotion to duty. What defined the concept of heroism in the age of chivalry? The concept of heroism in the age of chivalry was defined not by grand words and boastful claims, but by concrete actions taken in critical situations. True valor was considered saving one's lord at the risk of one's own life, carrying the banner out of an encirclement, covering the retreat of comrades, or holding a narrow passage, repelling the onslaught of superior enemy forces. These heroic cases were written about in chronicles, immortalizing the exploits of warriors for posterity. There are numerous accounts of a knight, wounded, fighting off several enemies at once, or continuing the fight, bleeding profusely, unwilling to surrender. Such stories were passed down by word of mouth, grew into legends, added weight to the hero's family, and significantly increased the importance of his lineage. How was death on the battlefield perceived? Death on the battlefield was perceived as a worthy end for a knight, a testament to his courage and devotion to ideals. The knight died fully armed, surrounded by his comrades, under the waving banners of his unit, fulfilling his duty to the end. He was buried with honors, along with his weapons, and sometimes even with his horse killed in battle, symbolizing the inseparable bond between the warrior and his faithful companion. If the body of the fallen hero couldn't be recovered from the battlefield, his name was entered in the lists of the dead and commemorated in churches, paying tribute to his courage and self-sacrifice. How long did these norms last? These norms and rules remained in effect until the end of the 15th century, when the emergence of mass armies, the widespread use of crossbows and cannons, and the employment of mercenaries changed the nature of war, making it more brutal and impersonal. But in the classical age of chivalry, honor on the battlefield was of paramount importance and was determined not only by victory, but also by how a person behaved in the face of death, remaining true to their principles and ideals. Where else did knights distinguish themselves? Military conflicts in the age of chivalry flared up not only within Europe, but also far beyond its borders, drawing knights into large-scale and bloody wars. One of the most significant areas where knights actively distinguished themselves were the so-called Crusades, which represented a unique phenomenon in which military service was closely intertwined with a religious mission. These campaigns, the aim of which was to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim rule, formed a special chapter in the history of knighthood, where participation in hostilities was perceived as an act of spiritual feat, bringing the warrior closer to God. How did the Crusades influence chivalric culture? The Crusades became an important and integral part of chivalric culture, having a huge impact on its development and formation. They combined religious duty, the pursuit of fame and recognition, and the opportunity to acquire new lands and wealth, expanding one's possessions. For many knights, participation in such a crusade meant not only fulfilling their religious duty, but also an opportunity to earn universal recognition, demonstrate their valor and loyalty to the church, and open up a path to advancement in feudal society. In the feudal world, where military service determined a person's position in society, a campaign to the east was seen as the highest form of service, allowing a knight to fully express himself. But what caused these crusades? By the middle of the 11th century, Muslim armies had seized Jerusalem, a city sacred to Christians, and posed a significant threat to Christian pilgrims visiting holy sites. This sparked outrage throughout the Christian world and served as one of the main catalysts for the Crusades, intended to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim influence and ensure the safety of Christian pilgrims. So, what happened next? Emperor Alexius Comnenus of Byzantium, facing a dire threat from Muslim armies, sought help from the Western powers, hoping for their support in the struggle to preserve his empire. The response to his plea was the famous call of Pope Urban II, delivered at the Council of Clermont in 1095. He addressed the knights of all Europe, appealing to their sense of duty and religious faith, urging them to liberate the Holy Land from infidels and protect Christians from oppression and violence. This passionate appeal resonated deeply in the hearts of thousands of knights, ready to embark on a journey to the east for a righteous cause. But why were so many people eager to participate in the Crusades? Participating in a crusade was seen by many as a unique opportunity to atone for their sins and earn forgiveness from God. The papal bull issued by the pontiff guaranteed complete absolution of sins for those who fell in battle while fighting for the faith. This fundamentally changed the attitude towards war, giving it a sacred meaning. The battle ceased to be merely a heavy obligation for a vassal forced to serve his lord. It became a sacred act of faith, the fulfillment of which led to the salvation of the soul. How did the Crusades affect the relationship between knights and religion? Thousands of knights from France, the German lands, Italy and England, inspired by the Pope's call, set out for the East, driven by religious zeal and a thirst for adventure. For many of them, it was a unique chance to prove themselves in battle, gain wealth and glory, and acquire new lands within the former Byzantine territories, in areas that Western sources referred to as the Holy Land. Some knights left their native lands, leading entire detachments consisting of squires, servants, and loyal vassals, ready to share with them all the hardships and deprivations of the campaign. The Crusades lasted for years, requiring a constant supply of provisions, weapons, and other necessary resources, as well as active participation in numerous sieges of cities and fortresses. What cities became key in the Crusades? Battles for cities such as Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli became a true test of courage, resilience, and military skill for the Crusaders. Participation in a crusade significantly elevated a knight's status in society, making him a hero in the eyes of contemporaries and descendants. His name was mentioned in chronicles recounting the exploits of the Crusaders, and his descendants were proud of their connection to the great cause of the Church. In many cases, participation in a crusade became grounds for official knighting, giving this event special significance. How did knighting ceremonies take place during the Crusades? If a warrior distinguished himself in battle, demonstrating bravery, valor, and dedication to the cause, and received gratitude and recognition from commanders and priests, he could be elevated to the knighthood right in the military camp, in a solemn setting. This gave the knighting special meaning and symbolism. It was performed by high-ranking bishops, influential barons, and sometimes even the king himself, emphasizing the importance of this event. Such a knight was perceived as a true defender of the faith, and his new status was immediately recognized by everyone around him. And how did children become knights? Some knights participated in the Crusades from childhood, gaining their first combat experience at a young age. Sons of noble families accompanied their fathers on long campaigns, learning to fight on foreign soil and gaining experience from older comrades. This was an important part of knightly education, allowing a young man to prepare for a future military career. For successful participation in a crusade, a young man was rewarded with a sword, shield, and the right to wear spurs, symbolizing his belonging to the knighthood. How did the Crusades influence culture? His name was inscribed in the circle of knights who had passed through fire and blood, but remained faithful to their ideals and religious beliefs. The Crusades were also seen as a difficult spiritual journey, requiring selflessness and sacrifice. Images of pilgrimage, holy war, and fighting for the faith became an integral part of knightly culture, having a profound impact on the literature, art, and music of the time. Campaigns in the East were covered in numerous sermons, songs, and legends, celebrating the heroism of the Crusaders and their struggle to liberate the Holy Land. But were the Crusades really that noble? Every knight who served in the Holy Land was seen as a witness to a special time, a participant in a great historical event. His shield could bear an image of the cross, symbolizing his faith, his sword, an imprint of the oath given during his knighting, and his name, a memory of the sacred duty fulfilled before God and people. However, despite the high spiritual meaning, the Crusades were accompanied by numerous manifestations of cruelty and violence. Violations of discipline, looting, disputes between commanders, massacres of civilians, and conflicts with Byzantium and Muslims left dark traces in the history of the Crusades. What was the most tragic event? Especially tragic was the capture of Constantinople in 1204, when Western knights, instead of fighting the Muslims, plundered the Christian city, causing it enormous damage and destruction. This event undermined trust between East and West, dealt a serious blow to the Byzantine Empire, and showed how far the goals of the Crusades could deviate from their original noble purpose. Nevertheless, despite all the negative consequences, participation in the Crusades became an important stage in the history of knighthood, having a significant impact on the formation of its moral and ethical principles. What awaited the knights in the future? The military conflicts of that time had a profound impact on the formation of a unique military culture, where religious beliefs, the pursuit of glory, and the awareness of duty merged together, defining the meaning of service. It was not just participation in battles, but something more, a sacred mission, sanctified by faith and reinforced by a thirst for recognition. In the future, we will examine in more detail how these lofty ideals became the foundation for the emergence of knightly orders, unique military brotherhoods, united not only by military skill, but also by an unbreakable oath of allegiance to common principles. What else besides faith united warriors in those days? Military orders became one of the most striking and significant embodiments of knightly culture, leaving an indelible mark on history. They arose as a response to the pressing needs of the era, including the need to ensure the protection of pilgrims, guard Christian shrines, and retain conquered territories. Unlike ordinary knights, whose service was determined by personal loyalty, vassal obligations, and family ties, members of the orders were subject to strictly regulated statutes and iron discipline. Their ideology harmoniously combined asceticism, characteristic of monastic life, and a constant readiness to conduct military operations, forming a unique image of a warrior monk. But how exactly did the combination of these two opposites affect their daily lives? The most famous and influential of these organizations was the Order of Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. It was founded in Jerusalem in the early 12th century, around 1119, by a group of French knights led by Hugh de Payan. Initially, the order's task was to protect roads and ensure the safety of Christian pilgrims heading to the Holy Land, who were constantly attacked by robbers and hostile tribes. How did a small group of knights manage to transform into a powerful organization that influenced the politics of entire states? With the permission of the King of Jerusalem, the knights were granted a plot of land near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, which is what led to their name, Templars. The order quickly gained recognition and support from the church. In 1129, Pope Innocent II granted the Templars special privileges, including subordination directly to the Holy See, the right to build their own churches, and exemption from taxes. This ensured their independence from local authorities and contributed to strengthening their internal unity and discipline. What other factors contributed to the rapid growth of the Templars' influence? The order's charter, developed under the guidance of Bernard of Clairvaux, an influential abbot and outstanding theologian, included strict requirements for modesty, poverty, celibacy, and the unwavering carrying of weapons. Templars were forbidden to leave the order. They wore white cloaks with a red cross and unconditionally obeyed their commanders, just as monks obey the abbot of a monastery. The combat capability of the order was extremely high. The Templars took part in key battles in the east, such as the Battle of Ascalon, the defense of Jerusalem, and the Battle of Hattin, demonstrating outstanding courage and military skill. Their units were distinguished by iron discipline, excellent weapons, and unwavering steadfastness. In battle, they usually fought in the center of the battle formation or formed shock groups, breaking through the enemy's defenses. What tactical techniques did they use to achieve victory? Thanks to their military successes, the order won universal respect and accumulated immense wealth. Soon, the Templars became owners of vast lands, castles, and commanderies in Europe. They were actively involved in financial operations, providing loans, storing pilgrims' funds, and even transferring money for kings, becoming one of the most influential financial organizations of that time. But how did they manage to combine military campaigns with profitable business? Another influential military religious order was the Hospitallers, also known as the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Their history began somewhat earlier, with the founding of a hospice for pilgrims in Jerusalem in the mid-11th century. In 1136, the order was officially recognized by the Pope and transformed into a military organization, combining the functions of protecting pilgrims and providing medical assistance. What were the differences between the Hospitallers and the Templars? The Hospitallers wore black cloaks with a white cross and remained true to the ideals of mercy and protection. Their duty continued to be the treatment of the wounded and the care of the sick, but in the face of constant wars, they became a full-fledged military force. Their garrisons defended fortresses, guarded caravans, and participated in sieges, demonstrating not only compassion, but also military prowess. How did the Hospitallers combine caring for the sick with military service? Both orders were actively involved in building a network of powerful fortresses in the eastern Mediterranean, stretching from the coast of Syria to the Upper Galilee. Among the most famous of these were Montfort, Crac des Chevaliers, and Safed, which became symbols of the Western presence in the east. The knight warriors of the order were subordinate to the master and lived according to a strict code in which personal initiative gave way to collective discipline. Their oaths were for life, and leaving the order was equated with betrayal. But were the knightly orders only active in the east? A special role in the history of the Middle Ages was played by the Teutonic Order, also known as the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. It was founded around 1190 during the siege of Acre, when German knights organized a hospital brotherhood to help the wounded. Just a few years later, the order adopted the statutes of the Templars and Hospitallers, becoming an independent military force ready to defend Christian interests in the region. What goals did the Teutonic Order pursue, and how did it differ from its brothers? The members of the Teutonic Order wore white cloaks with a black cross and communicated mainly in German, which made it especially attractive to knights from the Holy Roman Empire who sought to serve under a banner close to them in spirit and culture. Unlike most other military religious orders, whose activities were mainly concentrated in the Holy Land, the Teutons moved their activities to Eastern Europe, where new lands awaited them to conquer and new enemies to subdue. How did the change of geography affect the nature and goals of the order? From the beginning of the 13th century, they began to wage a fierce struggle against the Baltic tribes, as well as the Prussians and Lithuanians, seeking to spread their influence and establish control over vast territories. As a result of these conquests, the Teutons founded their own order state on the lands of the southern Baltics, creating a unique political entity that combined elements of military dictatorship and feudal rule. In the conquered lands, they actively built powerful castles that served as strongholds for controlling the local population, established German law, introduced feudal administration, and conducted prolonged military campaigns aimed at expanding their possessions and suppressing resistance. How were they able to combine religious ideals with brutal colonization? The Teutonic Order retained the discipline, strict vows, and fundamental ideology inherited from its predecessors, but at the same time managed to create a stable state structure capable of effectively managing the conquered territories and resisting external threats. This state lasted for more than 2 centuries, becoming a striking example of how a military religious order can transform into an independent political force. The Teutonic Order became an embodiment of the transition from the pilgrimage service, characteristic of the early stages of the Crusades, to territorial knightly rule, focused on expanding possessions and strengthening power. But what happened to the spirit of chivalry when the era of the Crusades came to an end? The military orders that arose during the Crusades were a unique combination of service to the faith and iron discipline, where religious ideals served as justification for military actions and military valor was considered a manifestation of devotion to God. However, orders also existed within Europe itself, striving to preserve knightly ideals and traditions in a changing world. As the feudal structure gradually lost its strength and noble honor demanded new forms of expression, new brotherhoods began to appear at the courts of European monarchs, different from their predecessors in that they were not military, but rather symbolic in nature. What values did they seek to preserve? In the second half of the 14th century, the knightly ideal gradually lost its significance as the basis of the military system, but at the same time retained its value as a symbol of devotion, high moral principles, and noble rank, remaining an important element of aristocratic culture. Monarchs sought to preserve the spirit of chivalry that had inspired generations of warriors, giving it a new form in the form of a regulated privilege and honorary brotherhood at the royal court, where knightly traditions could continue to live and flourish. How did monarchs use chivalry to strengthen their power? Thus, courtly orders appeared, which formalized knightly values within the framework of the royal hierarchy, giving them a new, ritualized form, reflecting changes in the political and social structure of society. In England, such a symbol was the Order of the Garter, established in 1348 by King Edward III, who sought to strengthen his power and create a circle of knights loyal to him. The order included 26 knights, selected personally by the king, and was considered the highest award for outstanding military merit and boundless personal devotion to the monarch. The residence of the order became Windsor Castle, where solemn ceremonies were held and insignia were kept, symbolizing the greatness and power of the order. What rituals were associated with the Order of the Garter? The Knight's Order Garter was made of dark blue velvet and decorated with golden letters of the motto, which read, "Shame on him who thinks evil of it," symbolizing the purity of thoughts and the impeccable reputation of the members of the order. It was worn on the thigh and symbolized belonging to the highest circle of knightly honor, being a visible sign of election and a special position at court. The rituals of the order retained elements of medieval solemnity, including initiations, lavish feasts, and participation in processions, but their meaning was more courtly than martial, reflecting a shift in emphasis from military valor to political loyalty. The order turned into an instrument of political recognition and strengthening loyalty, and not into a military brotherhood ready for battle. But how were things with knightly orders in France? In France, the analogue was the Order of the Star, established in 1351 by King John II, nicknamed the Good, who sought to revive the moral foundations of chivalry and make the nobility an example for his subjects. The symbol of the order was the Star of Bethlehem, associated with divine light and spiritual enlightenment, and only nobles who had proven their loyalty and service to the king became members of the order. What goals did the King of France pursue when creating this order? Unlike the English model, the French order had a pronounced religious coloring, emphasizing subordination to spiritual authority and strict adherence to the dogmas of the Catholic Church. However, the charter of the order also included a rule prohibiting retreat from the battlefield, which became its tragic element, playing a fateful role in the history of the order. During the Battle of Poitiers, which took place in 1356, many members of the order died, unwilling to violate their oath and preferring death to dishonor. King John himself was captured, and the reputation of the order was severely undermined, demonstrating that blindly following knightly ideals could lead to disastrous consequences. What happened to chivalry in the future? Despite the formal differences between them, both orders reflected a general trend towards adapting knightly ideology to new realities, where old values had to find their place in a changing world. The former norms, based on personal oaths of allegiance and unwritten rules, were now enshrined in strict charters approved by the royal will, which testified to the strengthening of centralized power and the desire of monarchs to control all aspects of the lives of their subjects. Belonging to the order meant not only recognition of merit and expression of gratitude for faithful service, but also inclusion in a new circle of power, where the symbols of chivalry served as an expression of state and dynastic stability, strengthening the authority of the ruling dynasty and demonstrating its inviolability. What role did knightly orders play in the political life of that time? Members of these orders actively participated in important negotiations, solemn ceremonies, and responsible diplomatic missions, and their impeccable behavior served as a role model for the entire court aristocracy, shaping standards of etiquette and defining norms of behavior in the highest circles of society. Knightly orders consolidated the discipline, clear structure, and rich symbolism of the estate. But the inner essence of chivalry, its true spirit, lay not only in strict charters and external attributes. What constituted the basis of knightly morality? Behind heraldic coats of arms, inspiring mottos, and carefully designed rituals lay an unwritten but no less important ideal of behavior, which was not always reflected in written sources, but was passed down from generation to generation through upbringing, religious rituals, and established customs. This unwritten code of honor defined what a person carrying a sword and shield should be, shaping the moral foundation of the estate and determining its place in society. What requirements did a true knight have to meet? The code of honor ascribed to a knight combined personal valor, unwavering loyalty, and unconditional obedience to the established order, forming a complex system of values that defined the knight's behavior and actions. A knight was expected to be utterly devoted to his lord, never retreat in battle, keep his sworn word, and maintain strict order in his dealings with subordinates, demonstrating his adherence to feudal ideals. A special role in this system was played by the oath, considered a sacred act. the violation of which was regarded not merely as a mistake or oversight, but as a moral failing, betrayal and perfidy, threatening exclusion from the circle of equals and loss of knighthood. Duty to one's lord, society and God was inextricably linked to the concept of righteous service, in which outward valor and martial skill corresponded to inner order and high moral principles. How did knighthood relate to religious ideals? In the second half of the 12th century, under the influence of the Church, the notion of a knight as the protector not only of his castle and his personal interests, but also of all the weak and defenseless in need of help and protection, became increasingly widespread. He was expected to defend widows, orphans, and all those suffering injustice and oppression, demonstrating his willingness to serve society and protect it from evil. These requirements were partly symbolic, but had significant weight in shaping public opinion and defining the role of knighthood in society. The knight was ascribed the duty of being a just judge, a restrained victor, and a generous patron, capable of compassion and helping those in need. The very image of the noble rider standing between evil and the defenseless became an integral part of the general concept of an ideal order, where each member of society occupies his place and fulfills his function. What else, besides defending the weak, was included in the duties of a knight? A special place in this unwritten code was occupied by the theme of service, which defined the knight's relationship with the world around him and his place in the feudal hierarchy. The knight served those he considered above him, namely God, his suzerain, and his chosen lady, demonstrating his devotion, loyalty, and willingness to self-sacrifice. This underscored his discipline, subordination to the hierarchy, and recognition of authorities, which were the foundation of feudal society. The ideal was considered to be one who knows how to control himself, manage his passions, and act out of a sense of duty, not under the influence of fleeting emotions. Against the backdrop of feudal cruelty and arbitrariness, it was precisely this internal self-restraint and composure that became the hallmark of a noble warrior, setting him apart from the general mass. What significance did service to a lady have in knightly culture? Service to a lady occupied a special place in this complex system, being not merely an expression of personal feelings, but rather a form of courtly ritual reflecting court customs and norms of behavior. A knight, acting on behalf of a noble woman, demonstrated his belonging to high society, his discipline, courtesy, and recognition of authority, confirming his status and position in society. This rite usually took place within the framework of knightly tournaments, duels, and poetic contests where knights could demonstrate their valor and mastery of words. Was service to a lady of an intimate nature? Various offerings and tokens of attention from a highborn lady did not necessarily signify an intimate connection or amorous relationship, but rather were an act of symbolic submission, an expression of gratitude for the honor bestowed, and a recognition of the knight's merits. Courtly love became an important element of court ideology, defining the norms of behavior and relationships between men and women in the highest circles of society. Its rituals, described in detail in numerous poetic works and ballads, required the knight to be temperate, constant in his feelings, and humble before his beloved, extolling her beauty and virtues. In the songs of the troubadours, the lady often appeared as an unattainable ideal, and the knight was her faithful servant, ready to suffer, obey, and remain silent, if only to be worthy of her favor. But how long did the ideal of courtly love last? In those days, a special atmosphere was forming in which social contradictions, inevitably arising between different classes of society, found their resolution in refined and sophisticated forms of communication. One of the most striking and memorable examples of this phenomenon is the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. This tale tells of a knight whose love for a married lady, namely the king's wife, puts him before a most difficult internal conflict. He is torn between deep feeling and unbreakable duty. Such fascinating plots, full of moral dilemmas and dramatic experiences, subsequently became the cornerstone of European chivalric literature, exerting a huge influence on its development and formation. However, what awaited the knights next? The chivalric code of honor regulated not only behavior in battle, where courage and mastery of weapons were paramount, but also the knight's appearance. A representative of this noble class was expected to have impeccable cleanliness of clothing, neatness in his entire appearance, and, of course, exquisite and noble speech. Manners, the ability to behave at court, to participate in conversations effortlessly, to uphold the honor of one's lineage. All these qualities were considered no less important than the ability to fight and win in duels. Thus, the chivalric code became the basis of cultural identity, harmoniously combining external gloss and internal discipline, forming the image of an ideal warrior and aristocrat. It was a set of rules defining all spheres of a knight's life, from his behavior on the battlefield to his manners at the table. But how different was theory from practice? But despite all the loftiness of the ideals, in real life the actions of knights often turned out to be far from the perfection proclaimed by the code of honor. Behind the beautiful words about honor and loyalty often lurked a completely different image, crude, mercenary, and driven solely by force and personal gain. Medieval society, unfortunately, allowed many forms of violence, and the knight in this society was vested with the legitimate authority to use force, which often led to abuse and arbitrariness. The power and strength that knights possessed often became the cause of their cruelty and atrocities. What was the common people to do in such a troubled world? In conditions where laws were weak and inconsistent, and justice was often wielded by the sword, the knightly class exerted tremendous pressure on the surrounding world, not only in the context of military conflicts, but also in everyday life. Knights could declare blood feuds, begin sieges of castles, or lead armed detachments to restore justice, which often meant seizing someone else's territory or avenging an insult. Such conflicts were formerly considered personal, but very often escalated into protracted and bloody wars between entire families, drawing many innocent people into their vortex. However, what methods did knights use to achieve their goals? Attacks on castles, accompanied by looting and destruction, the burning of villages, depriving people of shelter and livelihoods, the taking of prisoners for the sake of huge ransoms. All this was an integral part of the political toolkit of the time. Paradoxically, however, external rituals of decency were carefully observed. The opponent was challenged to battle, a messenger was sent with a declaration of war, and a symbolic glove was handed over as a sign of challenge. But the essence remained the same, a fierce struggle for power, land, and influence, in which there was no place for compassion or mercy. How did this affect the lives of ordinary peasants? The situation of the common people, who were completely dependent on the will of the feudal lord, was particularly difficult and disenfranchised. The armed knight, possessing absolute power over the lands, disposed of the fate of the peasants living on these lands as his own property. Cases of rape, violent requisitions, when peasants were deprived of everything they had, and the destruction of farms for the slightest disobedience are recorded in many historical chronicles, painting a grim picture of the life of the common people in those turbulent times. Did the Church try to influence the situation in any way? In the 11th and 12th centuries, the Church, realizing the full horror of what was happening, tried at least to limit such actions by introducing the Peace of God movement, which implied a ban on violence against unarmed people and members of the clergy. But unfortunately, in reality, such norms were rarely observed, and peasant houses continued to burn, crops were destroyed, and families were abducted or subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment. What specific examples of cruelty have come down to us? The chronicles of Geoffroy de Villehardouin and Galfred of Monmouth provide numerous examples of how entire villages were wiped off the face of the earth for the slightest attempt to not pay an exorbitant tax or refusal to supply food. During feudal wars, knights could not only burn villages, but also stage demonstrative punitive actions to intimidate the population and suppress all resistance. One such horrific case occurred in the Lyon region in the early 12th century, when, after the death of a knight, the peasants refused to hand over the murderer. In retaliation, the entire village was surrounded and set on fire, and those who tried to escape the fire were mercilessly slaughtered, and no one was punished for this monstrous crime. Was cruelty only manifested in large acts of intimidation? Cruelty was also manifested in small things, in everyday situations, when knights, taking advantage of their power and impunity, mocked ordinary people. Complaints have survived about how knights beat people in market squares just for not stepping out of the way in time, failing to show due respect. In The Miracles of St. Foy, a flagrant episode is described in which one of the lords knocked out a baker's teeth for not bowing low enough upon meeting him. Benedictine monks in the chronicles of the Cluny Abbey report numerous cases when clerics were beaten for delaying the issuance of tithes and women for refusing food or lodging. Where has mercy gone? Such acts of wantonness and violence were an integral part of life at that time, where a knight, being beyond all control and accountability, acted solely at his own will, guided only by his whims and desires. Even on the Crusades, where knights acted as warriors of the faith, defenders of Christianity, there were frequent instances of looting, slaughter, and reprisals against the civilian population. During the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, according to various estimates, up to 70,000 people died. The city was plundered, mosques were destroyed, and the Jewish quarters were burned to the ground. The participants in the campaign, justifying their atrocities, explained their actions as righteous anger directed against the enemies of the Christian faith. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the most outstanding leaders of the Crusaders, unfortunately made no attempt to stop the wave of violence that swept through the Holy Land after its conquest. Although he renounced the royal title, seeking to emphasize his modesty and devotion to the faith, he nevertheless concentrated all the power in his hands in the conquered territories. Lands were generously distributed to his closest associates and companions, new, often exorbitant taxes were established, and power relied solely on brute force and not on law and justice. Thus, the conquered lands were plunged into chaos and lawlessness, where the rights of ordinary people were not respected. Was there really no knights who truly lived up to the ideals of honor and nobility? William Marshall, who lived in England in the 12th and early 13th centuries, is rightly considered an exemplary knight, the embodiment of all those virtues that were attributed to this noble class. He served in the court of 4 kings, showing loyalty and fidelity, participated in many wars, demonstrating courage and skill, attended important court sessions, and participated in complex negotiations, proving his intelligence and diplomatic skills. But interestingly, his brilliant career began with participation in tournaments, where the sole purpose was to obtain money. He shamelessly captured defeated knights and demanded huge ransoms for them, thus amassing his fortune. And only after becoming Earl and Regent of England did he begin to pursue the very policy of honor and justice that his biographers so glorified and which became legendary. So, is the knightly code just a beautiful fairy tale? Thus, the knightly code by no means excluded violence. It merely tried to give it a certain form, to clothe it in the framework of decency. Violation of the oath, although considered a reprehensible act, did not always entail universal condemnation, and there was almost always a justification, which consisted in achieving a higher goal, whether it was the protection of faith or the interests of the state. There was always a plausible pretext to justify even the most cruel and inhumane acts. What did knights do in peacetime? In addition to military operations, which occupied a significant part of a knight's life, leisure also played an important role. In the periods between campaigns, sieges, and conflicts, the knight remained part of the courtly culture, participated in various rituals, communicated with lords, strengthened his reputation and position in society through participation in rituals and entertainment, demonstrating his strength, wealth, and nobility. What entertainment was the most popular among knights? The most striking and spectacular form of such leisure was knightly tournaments. This was a place where knights could hone their combat skills, demonstrate their merits, and resolve issues of honor and position in society. The tournament was not only an exciting spectacle, but also an integral part of knightly life, combining military training, public recognition, and political calculation. This was an event that both knights and ordinary spectators looked forward to with anticipation. How did the first knightly tournaments take place? In the conditions of feudal Europe, where wars were not waged continuously, the tournament became the place where a knight could prove his strength, win a name, and expand his circle of connections. Participation in tournaments was practically mandatory for those who sought fame and promotion. The first information about such competitions dates back to the 11th century. In the early stages, tournaments were mass battles of detachments, often taking place in fields between castles. These were extremely dangerous events because the knights fought at full strength, the weapons were real, and injuries, including fatal ones, were commonplace. How did tournaments change over time? By the 12th century, the tournament had acquired a more formalized character. Clear rules and regulations appeared. The tournament program included a division into disciplines, among which the joust, or as it was also called, the joust, where two horsemen collided with spears in a limited space, took a central place. The rules of the joust involved a mounted duel with a long spear, blunt at the end, but with a solid tip. The goal was either to knock the opponent out of the saddle or to break the spear against his shield or armor. The exact number of broken spears could determine the winner. Sometimes the fight continued with foot weapons if both participants remained in the saddle after 3 strikes. Victory brought not only fame and honor, but also, in some cases, a ransom for the defeated knight. What other types of competitions existed at tournaments? Tournaments of this kind were especially valued at courts, where records of results were kept and symbolic prizes were awarded to the winners. There were also dueling competitions, most often with swords or maces. These fights were held in a fenced-off area, the so-called lists, and were accompanied by strict restrictions designed to reduce the risk of serious injury. Sometimes weapons with blunted blades were used, but not always. Victory was awarded when a helmet was lost, when falling to the ground, or by decision of the judges, depending on pre-agreed conditions. Such duels made it possible to demonstrate not only strength, but also technique, endurance, and the ability to wield weapons in close combat. How were knightly tournaments prepared and held? Tournaments were held on specially prepared sites located near cities or castles. Their construction required significant financial costs, so the organization of tournaments was usually the responsibility of major feudal lords or even the kings themselves. Before the start of the tournament, the flags and coats of arms of the participants were displayed, and the judges ensured strict compliance with the rules. The tournament was accompanied by solemn ceremonies, a presentation of the knights, the awarding of ribbons and gloves from noble ladies, solemn oaths, and sometimes prayers in the chapel. The presence of noble ladies and representatives of the upper nobility made the tournament not only a spectacular event, but also a place for prestigious communication and the establishment of useful connections. The reward for winning a knightly tournament could be very diverse. The weapons of the defeated opponent, which were considered a valuable trophy, a ransom for the losing knight, gold coins, a horse, or luxury items. In some particularly successful cases, the winner could receive the patronage of an influential lord, a position at court, or even a marriage proposal with a profitable match. But it was especially valuable to receive a sign of attention from a noble lady, a ribbon, a belt, or a wreath, which became a symbol of triumph and recognition. The tournament was also often used by knights as a means of gaining political favor, because a knight who managed to impress a powerful lord could receive an invitation to serve or a generous landholding. How did the awarding ceremony for the winner take place? The nightly tournaments themselves followed a clear ritual scheme which was strictly observed. The sounds of drums solemnly announced the start of the competitions. The participants in the tournament entered the arena in full armor and lined up in accordance with the colors of their coats of arms, demonstrating their affiliation to a particular family. Before the start of the duel, each knight had to name his name and pedigree, confirming his noble origin. Some knights addressed the lady on whose behalf they fought, dedicating their victories to her. The judges carefully recorded the course of the duel and announced the winner. The defeated knight could be taken prisoner, for which a ransom was then paid. All these actions imitated the real conditions of war, but in a more controlled and safer format. What other entertainments were available to knights besides battles? In non-combat disciplines, knights participated in archery competitions, spear throwing, fencing, intellectual games, recitation of ballads, and writing of courtly poetry. Many tournaments were accompanied by lavish feasts, dances, and theatrical performances. This was a time when knights not only fought, but also demonstrated their knowledge of etiquette and manners, their ability to behave in society and maintain a conversation. And how were disputes between knights resolved? In knightly culture, there was a special type of duel that differed from tournaments and combat clashes. This was a formalized fight or duel conducted by agreement of the parties, often under the control of a lord or royal court. The duel could be used to resolve disputes about honor, inheritance, accusations of crimes, or breach of oath. Its conduct was subject to strict customs and rules, and the winner was recognized as right not only in the eyes of people, but also before God. How did a judicial duel take place? The oldest form of duel was the judicial ordeal by arms, which was widespread in the 11th to 13th centuries. If one knight accused another of a serious offense, such as treason, violence, or lying, they could not turn to the court in the modern sense. Instead, a duel was appointed, which was considered a kind of test sent down by God. It was believed that God would not allow a liar to win and would help the truth prevail. The battle took place in a specially designated area, in the presence of judges, priests, witnesses, and the Lord, who affirmed the decision. The defeated was considered guilty and could be deprived of his title, land, or even executed on the spot. Could someone fight in place of the accused? Such a duel was a form of justice, where iron replaced the word of law. However, not all accused knights fought personally. In certain instances, a knight could appoint a champion to fight on their behalf, particularly if they were elderly, ill, or lacked the necessary physical strength. This option was afforded by social class and high status within society. A champion, such as a professional fighter or a younger knight willing to take on the risk, would act for the accused. Victory or defeat would still reflect on the honor of the one who hired them. There were also cases where the accused tried to avoid the duel by paying a ransom or appealing to the church for protection, but this was condemned as cowardice. A striking example etched into history is the judicial duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, which unfolded in the heart of Paris in the summer of 1386. Carouges brought a serious accusation against Legris, alleging the violation of his wife. The legal proceedings reached a deadlock, failing to produce a definite verdict. And so, with the approval of King Charles VI, it was decided to resort to trial by combat. The arena for this spectacle was set up in full view of hundreds of witnesses, including the cream of French aristocracy and the entire royal court, all holding their breath in anticipation of the outcome. Carouges emerged victorious, defeating his opponent, and the loser's fate was sealed. He was executed on the spot. This dramatic episode went down in the annals as the last officially recognized judicial duel in France, bringing an end to an entire era. What were the real reasons for ending the practice of settling disputes in such a bloody way? Beyond judicial duels, duels of honor gained particular popularity during the heyday of chivalry. These clashes occurred between knights of equal status, a kind of informal competition often outside the confines of the judicial system. Any insult could be a reason to call for a duel, from refusing to apologize for an offense to public humiliation, interference in marital affairs, or even siding with a lady against her will. The duel itself was arranged by agreement between the parties in the presence of witnesses and accompanied by elaborate ceremonies. This ritual included declaring grievances, confirming the noble origins of both parties, swearing on a sword, and finally, the duel itself with the chosen weapon. Every detail of this process was important, and violating any rule could have serious consequences. But what happened when one of the parties refused to participate in the duel? Victory in such a duel restored tarnished honor, while defeat, on the contrary, covered the knight with indelible shame. In the event of refusing a duel, the offender could be branded a coward, resulting in the loss of social standing and respect. Despite the strict ritual and code of honor, the outcome of a duel often depended on brute force or simple luck. Many of these clashes ended in serious injuries, the death of one of the participants, or the exile of the loser from their native lands. Historical chronicles of the 15th century abound with mentions of similar clashes between noble knights, especially in Italy, Spain, and southern France. These stories are full of drama and intrigue, but how long could this practice continue in a changing world? As state courts developed and royal power increased, knightly duels began to face greater restrictions. The Church also condemned them as manifestations of pride and vigilantism, contradicting Christian commandments. By the 16th century, duels gradually shifted into the realm of aristocratic codes and ceased to be part of military culture. However, in knightly tradition, the duel forever remained a symbol of courage, determination, and a last resort to defend one's honor when all other arguments proved powerless. How did the knightly code of honor influence the development of military tactics and strategy in Europe? While the knightly class consolidated its position through elaborate rituals, tournaments, and codes, events were unfolding on the battlefields of Europe that irreversibly changed the military structure. The late 14th century saw the emergence of a new force, organized infantry, armed with long-range weapons and supported by centralized states. Everything that had constituted the knight's military and social advantage for centuries suddenly became vulnerable in the face of a new reality. How did these changes affect the role of knighthood in society? A key turning point in this military revolution was the widespread adoption of the crossbow, a weapon capable of piercing armor even at a considerable distance. The crossbow was relatively easy to master. Just a few weeks of training were enough for an ordinary peasant to hit a target from over 100 paces away. This became a factor eroding the class superiority of knighthood, whose military training took many years. How quickly was the military landscape of Europe changing in response to new technologies? Crossbowmen were particularly actively used in the Italian and Gascon armies, where their actions proved effective both in field battles and in the siege of fortresses. Mercenary crossbowmen also emerged, united into companies and operating independently of feudal ties. These units, free from feudal obligations, could be hired by any ruler willing to pay for their services. But how did crossbowmen interact with other types of troops on the battlefield? In parallel with the development of crossbowmen, the importance of infantry armed with long spears and pikes grew. In Switzerland and Scotland, peasants began to form units capable not only of repelling the onslaught of cavalry, but also of going on the offensive. These phalanx-like formations had advantages in density, stability, and maneuverability, making them a formidable force on the battlefield. How did the tactics of using pikemen affect the course of battles? Commoners, armed mostly with the simplest weapons, could, with the right tactics, destroy a fully equipped knightly detachment. A turning point in this process was the Battle of Crécy in the summer of 1346. The French army, consisting mainly of nobles, was confident in its victory. What factors led to the defeat of the French army in this battle? However, the English, taking a favorable position on a hill, deployed units of archers firing from powerful wooden longbows drawn with a force of 150 pounds. The arrows flew in volleys of 3 to 4 per minute, covering the knights who had not even managed to get close. Attempts to attack were thwarted one after another, burying the flower of French knighthood under a hail of arrows. What lessons were learned from this tragedy? Many representatives of the noblest families of France died in this battle. After that, it became clear that the onslaught of knighthood could be stopped with new technologies and tactical techniques. Almost 70 years later, in the summer of 1415, a new tragedy occurred on the fields of Agincourt, this time even more devastating for knighthood. What happened at Agincourt, and why did this battle become a symbol of the decline of knighthood? The French army, numerically far superior to the English, had a significant advantage in cavalry and weaponry. However, a fateful circumstance was the torrential rain, which turned the ground into an impassable quagmire. The French knights, forced to attack in these difficult conditions of mud and close quarters, could not deploy their forces to their full potential. A deadly hail of arrows, fired by English archers, rained down upon them. How can tactical errors and weather conditions affect the outcome of a battle? When the French warriors, exhausted and weary, finally reached the English infantry, they were completely spent. Heavy armor filled with moisture, restricting movement, and many knights were knocked off their feet and finished off by foot soldiers. Only those for whom a ransom could be paid were taken prisoner, reflecting the harsh reality of war, where financial gain often outweighed notions of honor and nobility. How did attitudes toward prisoners change on the battlefields? During this time, changes were also taking place in the very structure of armies. Instead of the feudal principle under which lords fielded their vassals, kings began to form mercenary troops. Funding came from taxes, and service was based on clearly defined contracts. The mercenaries acted in a disciplined manner, received regular pay, and were not tied to the land, which made them more loyal and effective soldiers. How did the transition to mercenary armies affect the role of knighthood? These changes made the knightly model of warfare obsolete. A person who did not have a noble title but possessed effective weapons and skills became no less important than a hereditary warrior. Economic factors also played a crucial role in this process. What economic factors contributed to the decline of knighthood? Equipping a knight required significant financial outlays. This kit included plate armor, a well-fed warhorse, personal weapons, a shield with a coat of arms, servants, and squires. All this together cost as much as the income from a small estate, making knightly equipment an exorbitantly expensive pleasure. Only a few members of the nobility could afford this level of equipment without the generous support of a powerful lord or king. How did the high cost of knightly equipment limit the number of knights? At the same time, the knight's effectiveness on the battlefield steadily declined. He was inferior to mobile pikemen, suffered from dense fire from archers, and when unhorsed, lost virtually all his advantages. More and more often, the knight was saved only by his ransom value, turning him into a valuable trophy on the battlefield. What factors led to the decline in the effectiveness of knights on the battlefield? Meanwhile, merchants and artisans were growing rich in the cities. They formed their own detachments, guarded trade caravans, hired warriors, and even participated in battles as part of city militias. The cities erected powerful fortifications, created their own arsenals, and gradually ceased to need the protection of feudal lords. How did the growth of cities and the development of trade affect the role of feudal lords? This definitively undermined the knight's monopoly on military power. Knighthood, long the emblem of martial might and social dominance, was gradually giving way to new forms of organization and warfare.